It's a pleasure to be back in this room after such a long absence. I know it looks a little bit different now than it did when we last filmed here, but it's good to be home. And today's episode is an especially good one because it's about trees. Now, if you've been watching the channel for some time, you might remember that early on we made a few episodes about trees, including one of my favourite episodes ever, Trees That Can't Be Climbed. Since then, though, we haven't really done much with trees, which is surprising given how ubiquitous they are. So today, we're going to return to the world of arboriculture with a tree that can help solve crimes, the clue tree. Now, if you've watched our videos before, you probably have a pretty good sense of how our research process works. We pick a topic and then we dive into the literature. But in this case, I actually started out by looking at real-life examples of clue trees. And what I found was not particularly promising. See, the idea of the clue tree is that people will leave clues associated with crimes or mysteries tied to trees. The police or investigators will then come along, find those clues and use them to solve the mystery. But in reality, most crimes are solved with forensic evidence collected by police, not by walking around a crime scene looking for clues tied to trees. And so, with no real-world examples to work with, I had to change my approach. I went back to the literature, but rather than searching for the phrase clue tree, I tried searching for trees that were somehow involved in crimes. And after a fair bit of searching, I came across this paper called Forensic Botany, an overview of woody plant evidence in criminal investigations. And that sounded perfect. Finally, there was an actual paper written about this. Unfortunately, though, as soon as I started reading it, I realized it wasn't quite what I was hoping for. This paper is more about how plants themselves can serve as forensic evidence. For example, pollen and fibers can be collected from a victim's clothing to identify where they were when they were killed or injured. And plant toxins can even be used as poisons. But none of this was about trees with clues tied to them. So I kept searching and eventually I found another paper which discusses how DNA can be extracted from chewing gum to identify who was chewing it. And while I think this could potentially fall under the umbrella of a clue tree, I wasn't getting anywhere near what I wanted. At this point I was starting to think that maybe there weren't any real examples of clue trees. And so I broadened my search terms to include just trees in general and crime in general, hoping to stumble onto anything. And this paid off big time because I came across this paper called Forensic Botany in Criminal Investigations, a review. And finally here, at last, was a paper discussing how trees themselves can be evidence in criminal investigations. It turns out that trees can be used in all sorts of ways to provide evidence. For example, a bullet lodged in a tree can be removed and examined to determine what type of gun was used. Or perhaps more relevant to our discussion today, damage to a tree can indicate what happened at a crime scene. You see, trees are pretty immobile, so they can serve as witnesses to events that happen around them. This paper gives the example of a case where someone shot at a tree, and by examining the tree, the police were able to determine which direction the shots came from and which type of gun was used. Another paper discusses how a body was hidden in a forest, and the position of the branches and leaves on nearby trees helped the police locate the body. And yet another paper mentions how a man was convicted of murdering his wife in part because he had attempted to burn her body in a barrel and left the charred remains in a wooded area. The tree in this case exuded resin in response to the heat from the barrel, and this resin trapped some of the woman's DNA. This last example is the closest we'll get to the clue tree concept, but it still isn't quite what we're looking for. The only paper I've been able to find that comes even close is this one, Trace Evidence from Trees in Forensic Science. And here the authors discuss how paint and glass fragments were found on trees near a crime scene. But again, this isn't exactly our clue tree. I mean, yes, it's true that these items were found on trees, but there was no evidence that they were left there intentionally as clues. At this point, I had two options. Either I could scrap this idea altogether and move on to something else, or I could try to do a little bit of world building myself and construct the clue tree for you all. And honestly, I couldn't bring myself to abandon the concept. Just because I couldn't find any examples of clue trees didn't mean that they didn't exist somewhere out there. Maybe they were rare, maybe they were regional, but either way, I was determined to make this work. I decided to draw inspiration from a system I'm familiar with, the Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling of Chemicals, also known as GHS. In short, the GHS is a standardized system used to classify chemicals based on their hazards. Chemicals are assigned various labels depending on their properties, and these labels serve as a sort of universal warning to those handling the substance. So, for example, the skull and crossbones indicates a lethal substance and the flame indicates a flammable substance. But in addition to these universally understood symbols, the GHS also includes a number of recommended pictograms, which are essentially little pictures designed to convey specific information. These pictograms are not required, but many organizations adopt them anyway since they can make information easier to communicate. Given that I wanted to create a system similar to the GHS, it only made sense to start out with their pictograms. After all, a picture is worth 1,000 words, and these words would have to carry a lot of weight. Each pictogram had to represent an entire class of substances, and ideally each class should include a wide variety of chemicals so as to be as useful as possible. Obviously, this meant I couldn't use every single pictogram since the GHS has over 300 of them, but I did try to select a range of pictograms that would cover as many potential scenarios as possible. This included things like skulls and flames, but also more obscure things like fish bones for toxicity to aquatic life and broken chains for substances that can cause fires to spread. Now, obviously, this is all well and good, but as I mentioned earlier, we're not trying to create a system that classifies dangerous chemicals. We're trying to create a system that classifies clues. And so I needed to decide what these pictograms would actually mean in this new context. Some of these were fairly easy to translate, such as the skull and crossbones, which would obviously still indicate a lethal substance. But others took a little more thought. For example, the GHS symbol for corrosivity is a metal with an eating into it. So obviously in the context of a crime, this would suggest an acid of some kind. But what would that look like on a tree? Well, I decided that a burn would do the trick. So wherever we find a tree with a burn on it, we can assume there was some sort of acid involved in the crime. In this way, I went through each of the pictograms and came up with what I felt was a suitable symbol for each on a tree. This proved to be a pretty fun exercise, but it did take some time. And so I won't subject you all to the full list. Instead, I'll just show you a few of the more interesting ones. For example, I decided that poison would look like a mushroom growing out of the tree. Explosives would look like shrapnel or perhaps a bullet hole. And evidence of a struggle would look like, well, a struggle. Now, once I had all the pictograms figured out, it was just a matter of coming up with a way to display them. It seemed only natural to put them on trees, but how? One option would be to carve them into the bark of the tree, but this would be fairly labor-intensive, and it could also damage the tree. My solution was to have the pictograms spray-painted onto the trees. And this also had the advantage of being easily reversible. I mean, you can always paint over spray paint. With the signs created, the next step was to decide where to put them. Now, in an ideal world, you'd have a clue tree for every potential scenario, but obviously that wasn't realistic. Instead, I decided to focus on a fairly narrow range of crimes and to make sure that there was at least one tree of each type for every crime. Here, for example, is a tree indicating a violent crime, one for sexual assault, and one for property crimes. And so that's the clue tree system I've come up with. Let me know down in the comments what you think. Do you have any suggestions for improvements or additions? Maybe I missed an important crime to include, or maybe you have a better idea for a symbol. Either way, I'm happy to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to check out some of our other videos about trees. I know it's been a while, but we do have some great content on the subject.